Hey there, guys. This is Cole. Welcome back to another movie review. Today I'm reviewing another Chuck Norris movie, and this is a movie I watched 2 nights ago for the first time, and that is the 1986 action movie Firewalker, starring Chuck Norris and Louis Gossett. And this is a movie that, when it came out, it was not well received at all by critics, and it was a box office bomb, but over the years, it has gained a huge cult following, and since I am a Chuck Norris fan, I did want to check this movie out. I watched it for free on Tubi a few nights ago, and I rather enjoyed the movie. So, what is the plot to Firewalker for those who don't know? Well, the plot of this movie is as follows. Max Donegan, played by Chuck Norris, and Leo Porter, played by Louis Gossett, two friends and treasure hunters, embark on an adventurous quest for gold when Patricia Goldwyn, played by Melody Anderson, a beautiful woman, claims to possess a treasure map. So that's basically the plot synopsis for this movie. So it is the closest thing Chuck. Basically, this has a lot of similarities to Indiana Jones. It's the closest thing that Chuck Norris did to an Indiana Jones movie, and while I do not think this is as good as the first three Indiana Jones movies, I do think it is a lot better than the last two movies in the franchise were. And honestly, I don't think this movie is anywhere near as bad as critics made it out to be. I mean, currently at the moment, this movie has 8% on Rotten Tomatoes, which I definitely do not agree with. And screw that website because, I mean, the reason I hate Rotten Tomatoes is because critics gave positive reviews to cuties on that website, and those reviews were definitely rigged, and yeah. So screw Rotten Tomatoes for doing that. So yeah, the fact that this gets crapped on, but that gets a pass by critics is absolute BS. But that's a whole nother topic, whole nother video, whole nother day. But anyways, the movie was released on November 21st of 1986 in the U.S., and when this came out, it was a box office bomb, and critics were not kind to the movie, but over the years, it has gained a huge cult following, and this was considered a disappointment, considering that Chuck Norris had a lot of big hit movies before this, but while I don't think this is quite his best movie or even as good as some of the other ones that, I've watched, this is a pretty good movie in my opinion. So, and pretty underrated if you ask me. So without further ado, let's get into my review. The movie starts off where we are introduced to Max Donegan, played by Chuck Norris, and Leo Porter, played by Louis Gossett, who are the two main characters of the movie. And in this opening scene, Max and Leo are driving a truck away from some enemies chasing them in other trucks, basically throwing bombs and shooting at them, which I will say is a very good opening action scene. Then, anyways, the truck Max is driving gets stuck in water, giving Max and Leo no choice but to surrender as they're surrounded, and Max and Leo are onto the ground with both their ankles and their wrist tied to wooden stakes that are basically stuck in the ground, and then the general arrives, and the general takes a picture of Max and Leo tied up together, stuck on the ground. Then the general said, and then we have the scene where the general says, "It has occurred to me that to leave you gentlemen here in this wretched heat with nothing to drink would be a cruel and merciless act. In 3 hours, your flesh will begin to blister. 2 hours later, your tons will swell. And all that time, you will be holding the liquid of life in your very own hand." And as the general says this, he puts a beer bottle in Max's hand, and the general gives an evil, maniacal laugh. And then we get to a very funny part right here where Max, played by Chuck Norris, starts laughing and says, "And you'll still be bald," really upsetting the general, which I thought that scene was funny. And the interesting thing about this movie, so most of the movies that Chuck Norris was a part of, most of his movies were rated R. He did have a couple of movies, like, most of the Chuck Norris movies are rated R. He did have a couple that were not, like, he did have a few PG-13 movies like Sidekicks and I'm trying to remember what else, but he did have a PG-rated action movie in the 1970s called Good Guys Wear Black. But yeah, this is also rated PG. And I will say, this movie isn't afraid to push the boundaries in some scenes, kind of like Indiana Jones. But anyways, the general then says, "Should you gentlemen need anything, just scream." And then he drives away. And then when once Max knows that the general is out of sight, he breaks the bottle and cuts him and his friend loose. And it's in Arizona, 5,000 miles away, but Max and Leo decide to travel to Arizona to Tubbs' bar to get a beer. And later that night at the bar, Max and Leo meet a woman named Patricia Goodwin, played by Melody Anderson. She claims to possess a treasure map, which interests Max and Leo as they're searching for a treasure that is lost Aztec, which is basically a lost Aztec gold mine in Central America. And one aspect I really like about this movie is the three main characters, Max Donegan, Leo Porter, and Patricia Goodwin. I thought that they were likable characters, and you definitely buy them as friends who care for each other. 10 minutes and 30 seconds into the movie, when Max, Leo, and Patricia are sitting at a table in the bar talking, a bad guy shoots a crossbow trying to hit them, but Max, Leo, and Patricia avoid it, and then they escape the bar and ride away on horses. And I will say, for a PG-rated movie, it's not afraid to get dark in certain areas. And our three main characters find a dark cave with human skeletons early on in the movie, and then Leo finds hieroglyphs on the wall, and these hieroglyphs date to the year 1527, basically Mayan hieroglyphs. And Max is basically holding and I like the part when Leo basically says to Max, hey, you think you could tell us something about this? And then Max, isn't sure, and then he's holding a human skull, and he says, "I bet you can't tell us," and then he starts laughing, which is pretty funny. And then he starts holding it until the eyes of the skull glow red, and he drops it, and then a dagger knife falls out. And then 17 minutes into the movie, a bad guy basically grabs Patricia and Mac and basically grabs Patricia, so then Max and Leo go to the rescue. But first, fight off some villainous Indians. And one thing I will say is that the action scenes in this movie are very well directed. This movie was actually directed by J. Lee Thompson, who directed 3 really good Charles Bronson movies. Funny enough, the same year this movie came out, J. Lee Thompson, he directed the 1986 action movie Murphy's Law with Charles Bronson, which that's an action classic. I love that movie. I recently reviewed that. He also directed Death Wish 4, The Crackdown, and Kinjite Forbidden Subjects, which are also other good Charles Bronson action movies. So I like the fact that he got to collaborate with Chuck Norris on a movie. That's pretty cool. And so Max basically tells this bad guy to drop the knife and let Patricia go. And the top of the knife handle glows red, and its supernatural powers make the bad guy jump to his death. And Max says, "Geez, I didn't ask him to jump." Rather well done scene. And 21 minutes into the movie, Max and his friends meet a person named Tall Eagle, and Leo says to him, "We want to hear about an Aztec priest who got here in the late 16th century. Do you know the story?" And Tall Eagle says yes, so he agrees to tell them the story, and Tall Eagle says he was called Firewalker because his soul could fly into the sun. We would gather his power, and his power was great. It was the Spaniards. They came in search of the Firewalker's gold. Legend says he flew into the sun, there to walk among the fire forever. This is the story of the Firewalker. It's all I know. Beware of the coyote. He is very treacherous and powerful." And then Max and Leo decide to head out to the car, but before Patricia leaves, Tall Eagle tells her, "Soon, many spirits will come to speak to you. some will be evil and very strong. So then he basically gives her a bag that he says it'll basically protect her from the evil spirits, and he claims that the bag has dust, bones, and magic in it. And I also do like the scene about 40 minutes into the movie where a really tall Spanish guy decides to cause trouble for no reason and starts beating up Leo in another bar that Max is in. And so Max saves Leo in the bar, and he chokes the Spanish guy out, and then a bunch of people start fighting him, so he has to take down the bad guys. Again, that's a pretty good action scene. I like the scene a little over an hour into the movie where where we as the audience, we think that these bad guys are about to cut off Max and Leo's head as they're being held captive. But before that happens, we see Chalky, Corky, a character who is good friends with Max, and he's happy to see Max and Leo. He then demands them to be cut free, so then, you know, his guards basically agree to let them go. And then there's a scene at nighttime where our three main characters are eating dinner and hanging out with everyone. And then the next morning, Max basically leaves and, you know, he says goodbye to his friend and stuff like that. So then Max, Leo, and Patricia decide to go camping in the woods. Basically getting closer to where they're trying to find the gold at. And we cut to a scene 1 hour and 15 minutes into the movie where we see that Leo has gone missing. And basically Patricia sees blood close to the river, but like on the grass. And so basically Patricia fears that Leo might have possibly been eaten by a crocodile that they see swimming in the water. But, you know, that's not true, because later on in the movie, we find out that Leo is being held captive by the main villain of the movie, El Coyote, who's basically an Indian villain, who basically threatens to lower Leo into hot spring gas by a rope if Max doesn't give the main villain, you know, what they want and stuff like that. So then, long story short, Max, Leo, and Patricia found the treasure. So long story short, though, Max manages to defeat the villain in a pretty awesome way. So then Max, Leo, and Patricia, after the bad guy is defeated, they found the treasure they were looking for and carry it away in bags. The movie then ends with Max, Leo, and Patricia, where they are sitting at a fancy restaurant dinner table, and the general is quite a few tables away from him, so quite a few tables away from them, so they don't see him, but the general says, "We meet again," and that's how our movie ends. So yeah, at the end of the day, while this is not quite my favorite Chuck Norris movie, I did rather enjoy it, and I do think this is an underrated movie. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give Firewalker a 9 out of 10. So yeah, anyways guys, that was my review on Firewalker, and there's not going to be any movie reviews for a couple of days because I actually have to leave. I actually have Friday off work, but I'm going up to Milwaukee to visit some family members, so there won't be any movie reviews or stuff like that for a couple of days. But yeah, just wanted to get this review out there before then. But anyways, guys, thanks for watching my review, and we'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye now.